answering your questions and diving a little deeper. This is the Midweek Rewind.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Midweek Rewind. Matt, we've got Pastor Brent with us again today, and we've got another a really exciting topic today. This will be fun. I'm excited to spend some time together. So, Brent, how you doing today?
Good. Hey, it's winter again. It's cold outside. I like the variety. I like the change. But sometimes you're ready for spring or just summer or something. But no, it's great.
Yep. Yet another reason why no one can tell what day it is, because no one can tell anyway. But then one day it's 80, the next day it's thunderstorm, the next day it's cold. You never know. So
yeah,
whatever day it is and whatever year we're in, looking forward to a conversation today. So again, the past couple weeks, again, everything's different. And so this little show is a little bit different from usual. We've been spending the first few minutes just talking about coronavirus and what the latest is and how we are both kind of dealing with all the craziness. And usually we talk about the previous week's sermon, go a little bit deeper, maybe go address some questions you didn't have time to on Sunday, and talk about the next upcoming week. But as I was kind of, scrolling through the web this week, I asked Brent if we could kind of pull an audible and do something different this week. So Brent, I know you don't spend a ton of time on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. You're not a big social media guy, but if you spend any time there, it seems like every week there's a new video circulating around. And it's last week or 2 weeks ago, there's a couple ER doctors who were talking about COVID, and they had kind of a different
from Bakersfield.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I'm impressed. You know what I'm talking about. Look at you. Yeah. So that was last week. That made the rounds, kind of in typical fashion. A bunch of people shared it, and then YouTube took it down. And then just a couple of days ago, I started to see a new one come up, and I think it's called Plandemic. And again, same thing. A bunch of people shared it. YouTube took it down. Now they're trying to find other ways to share it. So, and I want to be clear up from the front, and Brent, I think you're with me here, that neither of us have seen either of those videos. I've read about both of them, so I kind of know a little bit about what's going on, but we're talking from a perspective of not having seen the videos. So we have to get that out front. But Brent, so you at least read a little bit about the Bakersfield one. What are your kind of reactions as you see these come up? We'll kind of get into how we should handle them, but just talk to me about when you see stuff like that, what are some of your first reactions?
My first reaction is, I could call it the skepticism trust scale. I can't defend this. There's no scientific evidence. It's just my personal perspective is that all of us kind of fall on the scale of how much we trust what friends or authorities or police officers or teachers or parents or politicians say. Mm-hmm. We have a level of trust or a level of skepticism. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the COVID-19, it's a great case study on how people respond with a level of trust in their leaders or a level of distrust or skepticism. Mm-hmm. And it's everywhere. And so, Matt, if I were to say that I thought that there's a personality influence in this, that some people are just easygoing. And if some doctor says something, they just lean in. I'm not talking gullible. I'm just talking they lean in, and it's just who they are. Okay.
That's something I thought about bringing up is part of what's hard about this conversation is I think you and I are wired very similarly. So I think we have a fairly similar perspective on this, so we're not representing a perspective that's pretty popular, but keep going.
Right. And so by personality, I think it's not a Christian, non-Christian thing at all. It's not a faith thing. I just think that by personality, people fall on somewhere on that scale of easygoing and trusting, or skeptical and ask the questions. Some people are okay with not having certainty of an issue. Other people need to have all their questions answered. And so I think part of it's personality. And part of it, and again, it's the COVID thing as a kind of a test case. Some people by experience become more skeptical and mistrusting.
Mm-hmm.
So, example, if you've been in a couple of other churches where the elders or the pastor broke their word, maybe money was laundered, something, you're going to come to our church and you're not going to trust me as much.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm the most trustworthy pastor around, but you aren't. So some of it's personality, but some of it's experience. And it goes the other way. You can be skeptical about an authority in your life, but then you encounter some really good experiences and you begin to become more trusting.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just interesting how people are responding to the COVID thing, particularly
Mm-hmm.
government authority.
Yeah.
So anyway, your thoughts, Matt, on the whole, this internet thing, and people are saying it's just a big scam or whatever. Where do we go from here as Christians in how we respond to authority, or our level of trust or distrust or skepticism? And when is skepticism a good thing? Maybe I'll throw that at you. What would be an example of skepticism, or sometimes we call it critical thinking, tough questions? When is that a good thing?
Those are all I'm supposed to ask you the questions, Brent. Stop doing the role reversal here. You're really got all the answers. I think what's hard, again, we've talked about this the past few weeks, but all of us are in an unprecedented situation. And I think a lot of people in that scenario default to fear when they're trying to figure things out. And I want to be careful, because these aren't bad people and they're not necessarily wrong. It's just some people default to that. And one thing that I think the one thing I am a little scared of is just for the rest of my life and for the rest of the world, like truth, like discovering truth has never been harder. And so I feel for the people who are drawn to the latest news because they're trying to figure out the truth. And all of us are trying to figure out the truth to varying degrees, probably. But the people who are sharing these videos and are worried and scared, they're doing it because they're trying to discover what's true. And that's a good thing that all of us should be doing. But it's just, how far do we take that, and where does trust land on that? And I think you had a couple of Bible verses kind of about this topic that you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I'll bring those up. I'll toss out one thing that popped in my mind while you were talking there, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Our world would be a bad place if everyone trusted naively.
Right.
You trusted every teacher and professor and every politician and every pastor. It would be a terrible world if we were too high on the trust. And it would be a terrible world if you never believed anyone and your first response was always, they're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We actually need people at every point on this scale.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You shouldn't just naively trust every pastor just because they got the title.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you shouldn't start with doubt either. And how's that work?
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's a pastor or a teacher or a police officer or a politician,
mm-hmm.
It just, so yeah, a couple of the verses that I've raised before with our church, but one is in Acts 17:11, and it compares the Bereans and the Thessalonians, and it kind of be like comparing the Wichitans and the Newtonians. I mean, they were about 30 miles apart, right? And
Okay.
so those are the two cities. And it says the Bereans, so I would say the Wichitans, were more noble than the Thessalonians because, here's the critical part, they listened eagerly to what Paul said. That's the trust part.
Okay.
But they examined the scriptures daily to see if what he said was true. That's the fact checking. That's the skepticism. And I just think that's a good perspective. I know that if you're naturally a skeptical person, you were born that way, or if you've been betrayed by politicians or government leaders or pastors or friends, and you kind of move toward the I don't trust them side, I know it's hard to do the first part. They listened eagerly to what Paul had to say. The skeptics will find it easier to do the second part. They examine the scriptures, they search it out, they figure out whether COVID is really as bad as it was or it's worse or whatever. On the other hand, it goes the other way. You need to, those who are naturally trusting need to understand that there is a healthy place to ask critical questions. And critical is not negative. It's important. It's hard questions. And so, yeah, it's interesting. And I fall more on the trusting side. And so I have to remind myself to not, and I wouldn't consider myself a gullible person, Matt. But yeah, my first response is they're my authority. They're some kind of expert. I'll listen. But if I've been disappointed by a couple of newscasters, when I've done the fact checking, I'll kind of enter that conversation with some skepticism, that newscast with some skepticism, or that pastor with some skepticism. I was listening to a couple of podcasts last week of some really biblically solid pastors, and they're both big names with big churches. And I do want to emphasize that they're just biblical, they're sound. But it was interesting that in one week, I listened to two podcasts. There was a point or two that each of them made in a sermon that I thought, no, that's wrong. Now, overwhelmingly, they're right. And it wasn't a life or death salvation issue. It's just that how do we as Christians do the loving thing of leaning in with trust? And how do we do the truth thing of leaning in with skepticism? And is there a right way? Is there a better posture? Interesting question. Take a drink.
Go for it. I think one thing that's kind of hard is that, the verse you mentioned said that they examine the scriptures, and we as Christians have landed on the scriptures are true and they are a reliable source for us to, search for answers and find information. What's hard about COVID or the world, anything that you have a question about right now, is you can find 1,000 different answers to the same question from people who sound like they should be reputable. Brent, I'm guessing you're familiar with the term like confirmation bias. Like we tend to search for information that agrees with us. So I think one of the wisest things to do right now is to be aware of confirmation bias in, like you mentioned, like if you lean one way or the other on trust or skepticism, recognize where you lean and push yourself a little bit. Is that, or like, how else can we possibly navigate this other than searching the scriptures? What are the other things that we can actually do right now?
Well, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but the scriptures aren't going to answer the COVID issue. They're just not. So you're right. We're stuck with reading 1,000 different things, and we're not sure at the end of the day which one we should believe. And I don't know how to solve that. But you hit a good point when you said confirmation bias.
Mhm.
And again, what that means is you already have an opinion. That person is lazy. That's your opinion.
Mhm.
And so when you watch a particular interaction with that person, you confirm your already determined bias with their behavior.
Mhm.
But for all we know, they have a virus or they've got a health issue that doesn't allow them to work a lot.
Mhm.
But we have this confirmation bias, and we would do well as Christians theologically.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm well aware that I am a third generation Mennonite Brethren pastor,
Mhm.
and that biases me.
Yeah.
When I read the scriptures, and this is the big question, why, if Christians have the same Holy Spirit and the same Bible, they arrive at such different conclusions on theological issues? The short answer is we all have biases. We have this side of heaven, we have filters that keep us from always seeing truth.
Yeah.
Now, often we do, but I pray regularly, Lord, don't let my bias affect me.
Mhm.
And it's hard, but it's self-awareness. Another line I've liked, and I use this in relationships, Matt, but it's try to see the upside of the other side and the downside of your side.
Mhm.
So if I've got an opinion about a theological issue or about whether the models on the COVID crisis are correct,
Mhm.
or about whether the restrictions aren't strong enough or they're too strong, or whether the government is trying to take over our lives or they're just protecting people and they're not trying to take over. If I've got an opinion about something, it just will help if I step back and say, okay, do I have confirmation bias? How can I see the upside of the other side and the downside of your side, of my side?
Right. We had a great comment come in. I'll quickly go through it here. So our friend Marshall wrote in and talked about media literacy and just how it's just true that, like it or not, news is skewed by ratings and advertisements. That's just true. We don't like it, but it's true. And so she brought up some really good points. If you're watching, or you can read through what she wrote there. There's some really great things to consider there. Another thing, Brent, that I think people just don't always understand, kind of going along with that, is that literally anyone can make a video and make a website. Literally anyone. So just because it's online does not mean it's true. It's unfortunate that people take advantage of people's ignorance, and they can make a really shiny video on a really pretty website and it looks really real, but it could be absolutely garbage. And so I feel for the people who are really trying to discern truth, and both maybe a little bit of ignorance. It's not their fault, but they just don't understand how things work. Not their fault. Ignorance, and again, just the volume of things that are out there. It's just getting harder and harder. Well, as you were talking, Brent, one thing that popped in my mind is this past week, you talked about God's word, God's spirit, and God's people, and you were talking about leadership. Or no, I'm sorry, you were talking about temptation. Sorry, temptation. Yeah. But I wonder if what are those three things the best answer for us right now in this conversation too, is leaning out on those three things? Or how do we stand a fighting chance of just living well in this crazy time?
Well, I think that the number one thing we need to do is be quick to listen, slow to speak. Mm-hmm. We probably won't get in trouble. We won't harm the name of Christ. We won't alienate people if we talk less. And so I think the number one thing is when you're in a conversation with a friend, and particularly if they're not a church friend or they're not a Christian, like, your goal should not be to convince them that the government's doing it right, or the government's doing it wrong. So, if I'm talking to a neighbor and I'm not sure where they're at, and they kind of rant and rave a little bit about the government, I might say something like, well, yeah, I can see, sometimes I have those kinds of questions too, and I don't always know how to respond. Now, for me, I'm just a submit guy. I think that there's something about authority, and yeah, we got to test it, but I submit to God, even if I don't like or understand all the rules. I'll submit to my governing authorities. But yeah, I do have some questions. So we need to be careful in what we say and to whom we say it and how we say it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting journey for all of us, because none of us, I don't think, can say we know all the truth on the COVID issue.
Right.
And we're absolutely right on our perspective on the government's response.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow we try and show kindness and think about God's reputation. And
Yeah,
I think we do a lot better at not asking all the questions about who's right and who's wrong. And we start asking questions like, Jesus, what are you trying to teach me?
mm-hmm.
How can I be a witness? Those are questions we really need to spend some time on. But yeah,
and
so
that's important. Because one thing I've noticed, anytime this happens during elections, anytime there's big, buzzy, controversial news, it always bums me out a little bit to see some of the posts from some of my Christian friends. And unfortunately, that's true right now too, is that people who would never say certain things to someone face to face, they get pretty bold on Facebook, and they'll say some things that I wish they wouldn't say as a representative of Christians. So I think this is just another kind of good check yourself moment. And be careful about that, which leads me to another point that I think you wanted to talk about, was the whole grace and truth thing. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's a direct parallel with trust and skepticism. So all of us, I think, are naturally wired by personality, and then we're affected by our experiences. Mm-hmm. So the grace side gives a second chance and is relaxed and easygoing. Doesn't get all riled up when things don't go all right. You want to give a second chance and extend some grace. The truth part is the skepticism. It's the asking hard questions. Now, in John 1:14, it says that Jesus came full of grace and truth. I'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks with a little bit of art. But I find it interesting, and I don't want to read too much into this. And so if you want to do some pushback with a comment in the chat column there, you can. But question, why did John, in the Gospel of John, describe Jesus, the Son of God, who came full of grace and truth? Why didn't he say Jesus full of truth and grace? Now, again, I don't want to read too much into the order of those two words. Mm-hmm. Why did he describe Jesus first as grace, which is the trust, the second chance, the kindness, the easygoing, the, hey, and then secondly, as truth, which was the lower the boom, and there's a moral right and there's a moral wrong, and skepticism, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, I personally think that while Jesus is 100% grace and 100% truth, his first step into relationships is grace. God is love. Mm-hmm. His first step into relationship is the offer of grace. It's not his first step is this is what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, he's both, 100% of both, perfect truth and perfect grace, but grace comes first. And so I sometimes have pushed people, Matt, on this trust skepticism. Can we be grace and truth? Can we be trust and skepticism, not skepticism and grace? Or, but
Yeah. And I don't want to speak at it. I don't know the biblical scholar stuff behind this, but I think in a lot of Paul's letters, he finished with grace and peace, right?
right.
Wasn't grace always first there too? So
Yeah. And truth didn't even make the list sometimes. And there is a truth. So
yep. Yep. And our friend Marshall, thanks again for watching, Marshall. She says that she thinks grace and truth is in that order because truth being told without grace won't be heard. And I think that's right.
Right. You're not going to win very many people over by starting with truth.
Right.
You're going to win them over by starting with grace and kindness and leaning in and listening. So,
yeah. So we got a few minutes left here, Brent. As maybe we can kind of wrap up this part of the conversation. So, any kind of last thoughts or last words of advice? These things are going to keep happening. We're going to see more and more of these videos, more and more of these articles. So, let's pretend for a minute that you spend a lot of time on Facebook, which you don't. But let's pretend that you did. How would you encourage the rest of us to respond if we see it on Facebook or if our friends or family bring it up? Like, kind of closing thoughts on this. How should we handle this season?
It's a hypothetical situation, right? Because I'm not really there as much as some people, and I need to engage more. I understand that. Well received. But I think you hit it right earlier. Remember Christ. Remember his reputation. Your first goal is not to prove an opinion about COVID or the government or who's right or who's wrong. Your first obligation is to represent Christ well. And so filter your Facebook comments through Jesus. Like, sit Jesus next to you and say, Jesus, are you okay with me saying this? Is this the right thing now? Now, if someone does say something that's not healthy on Facebook and I know them and they're from my church, I'm certainly not going to respond on Facebook. Mm-hmm. I'll just give them a call.
Yeah.
And say, hey, have you thought about this? Mm-hmm. But I also don't want people to leave our little podcast today thinking we demonized skepticism.
Right.
Our world would be a terrible place if we didn't have people who pushed back.
Yep.
If we didn't have people who asked hard questions. That's why I think God just wires some of us to be leaning in on the trust and grace side by personality, and some of us on the skepticism and truth side. Some of us have a higher justice meter, and others of us are pretty easygoing. God knows we need balancing in this.
Yep.
Now, on the experience issue, for those of you who are listening who have experienced severe disappointment, some of you have been, I just say, for instance, ladies have been in very bad relationships with every man, and you don't understand why, and I'm not here to solve that now, but you now, by experience, don't trust any man. Okay, or you, by experience, don't trust any preacher, or you don't trust any politician. I think part of our walk with Christ is to say, okay, this is where I'm at in personality, but my experience has moved me to be far too trusting. The hurts in my life have moved me to be far too distrusting. Yeah. And that we say, Jesus, what work do you want to do in my life to bring me to the place you want me to be in the trust skepticism scale?
Yep.
But we are in no way saying trust is better than skepticism or skepticism is better than trust. We need both.
Yeah.
My push, Jesus came full of grace and truth. And I think a good first step is grace, but that doesn't demonize skepticism.
Yep.
We need everyone.
Yep. You're right. And we need we probably all should do. I mean, we should all do a little bit of research, and we should pay attention to the news, because heaven forbid if all these rumors are true, I want to know about them. Of course, I don't want to be taken for granted, or I don't want to be led by crooks. So, of course, you got to have both, and maybe push yourself wherever you need to be pushed. So that's good. All right. Well, as we wrap up, Brent, looking forward to another Sunday. People watching at home in their living rooms. You want to give us a quick recap of what's happening on Sunday?
Sunday, I'm maybe most excited about this sermon so far. This is the fourth week. It's on forgiveness and repentance. And it's not every day that I could say this. I think people are going to learn some new things. I think that they will experience, I pray, a really relevant talk on the importance of understanding what forgiveness is, how to do it, and what repentance is, why it's so important, and how to do that. Relationships can't be healthy without saying, I'm sorry, and saying, I forgive you. And so we're going to talk about apologizing, repenting, and forgiving, and I'm looking forward to it.
It'll be good. And I won't give away the big reveal, but speaking of relevance, you blew my mind this week with something that you're including in your sermon this week. I'm not going to give it away. People need to watch, but we're including something in the sermon we don't typically include. And your knowledge that this certain thing existed blew my mind. So watch on Sunday, because there's an added element that we don't typically include that I think people will enjoy. So
correct.
All right. Well, hey, Brent, thanks for your time. Our time is wrapping up here. And thank you to the many of you who are watching. And just a quick reminder, we also have this as a podcast. So if you're not ever able to watch live or later, you can check out the audio podcast and download it there as well. And help us spread the word so we can have some more people join us with this. I think it's a fun thing we're doing, and we want to have more and more people join us on this thing. So thanks for watching or listening today, wherever you are. Hope to see you again on Sunday and back next Thursday. Brent, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
All right. See everybody on Sunday next week.
Thanks for joining us today. Matt and Pastor Brent go live on the First MB Church Facebook page every Thursday at noon. If you can't watch live, the archive is available anytime on Facebook, YouTube, or the First MB app. If you prefer to listen on the go, you can also subscribe to the podcast by searching for the Midweek Rewind in your favorite podcast provider. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Midweek Rewind.